Good afternoon, everyone, in Science and Values. This lecture is going to be about Paul Feyeraband. He was a German American philosopher of science in the 20th century, known for somewhat radical positions as it relates to what science is and the status of truth in science. He, by all accounts, was a what we could call a skeptic regarding the ability to find any kind of truth in science, and also a relativist when it comes to truth in science. Um, and if you just, if you do a Google image search of him, you see he's kind of he is an eccentric looking individual. And he liked to say radical things and stir up trouble and cause trouble. And you can gather from the reading that you did for this week that that is the kind of person that he was and is. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have anything important to say. And even though I think you're going to be a little bit shocked and surprised by some of what you find in the reading for this week, um, he has some important things to say. He's giving us a critical eye towards why we regard science as so authoritative, why we place science on such a high pedestal. Um, and so, this reading in particular, the theme and the focus of it is why science. Not so we've been dealing with the question, what is science? And in asking what is science, we've been kind of assuming that there is something good about science. That just asking, if we're trying to figure out the nature and the essence of science as we were with Kuhn and Bacon and Popper, then we must regard there as being in something important about science. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asking the question, what is science in the first place? Whereas Feyerabend wants to come along and sort of push back and say, well, wait a second. We haven't actually argued for the superiority of science. We've just kind of assumed it. And he announces that pretty quickly um, on the first page of the reading. So on page 73, he says, there exists anyone who asks question B. And question B at the top was, what's so great about science? Which is just another way of saying, why science? The excellence of science is assumed, it is not argued for, right? So again, that's really, and when I've taught this in the past, I have a lot of students who don't like this reading. They bristle at it. They think that it is not really worth their time, that Feyerabend is kind of crazy, and trying to argue for relativism is kind of crazy, and, of course, science is just better than other ways of doing things, and, I really I want to invite you to take this reading seriously. I want to invite you to suspend some of your disbelief and to ask yourself, why would Feyerabend write this kind of piece? What is his motivation? He clearly believes the things he's saying. He is trying to get a reaction out of you. You'll notice that his writing is very rhetorical in nature, but he is convinced of the things he's saying, and he does think there is some truth to the things that he is saying. And I would encourage you also to please take a look at the additional readings. There's links on the syllabus. One of them is just an interview that somebody did with Feyerabend near the end of his life. And it's very revealing to hear him in an interview context rather than just in a kind of more scholarly piece. So please click on that link on the syllabus and read it, as well as another piece. And this is not a terminology that Feyerabend uses, but it is essentially what he is concerned with. And that is a term known as scientism. And anytime you attach that ism to something, you essentialize that thing. And you're arguing for a kind of authority that belongs to that thing when you add that ism. And scientism, even though the language isn't used by Feyerabend in his in what we're reading, it is a term I want you to be familiar with. And scientism is simply the belief that science is superior to all other modes of engaging with the world, of knowing the world. And it is a belief, in some ways, in the unquestioned authority of science. That if somebody were to um, ask, for example, why we should study the world scientifically, somebody who is an adherent of scientism would simply say, well, it's just obvious. Science is better. Science has been the thing that has given human beings the power and the ability to control nature and manipulate nature and to make progress. And so it's just the superiority of science is self evident. And it's that self evident sort of smug nature of the scientist who simply assumes that science is better. That is what Feyeraband is ultimately concerned with. So even though, again, the language isn't used, I want you to think about what is meant by scientism and to read that extra link I have on the syllabus about scientism, because I think um, there are some good examples given in that piece. But I want to sort of, I'll come back to that, but I want to come back to Feyerabend's art of. So, what are you reading? So, again, at the beginning, he says there are two questions: what is science, and what's so great about science? Feyerabend is more concerned with question B here: what's so great about science? Because he doesn't think anyone stops to provide an argument for what's so great about science. They simply assume its superiority, and he just wants to stop and say, is that unquestioned uh, is that unquestioned authority of science justified? That's the philosophical question here. Is the unquestioned authority that we give to science justified? And he doesn't. He's not convinced that it is justified, and he wants to sort of examine some of the things that people say about it. So um, he begins by making an allusion to how in the Middle Ages, for example, or in the medieval time period in Europe, that there was a close link between the church and the state. That 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 there was no separation, as we ordinarily think, especially in an American context, between church and state. The government and the church were, for all intents and purposes, one. And so whatever the church said, that's what you had to do. It wasn't this other sphere of our life. It was the church. And so the church and the government were the same. Feyerabend makes a kind of rhetorical point that he thinks that today science and the state are similar in nature. He says at the top of page 74, he says that of course, church and state are now carefully separated. State and science, however, work closely together. Right? So and I think if you had to sort of think of your own evidence for this, you might think about the extent to which uh, science is embedded within the government, the extent to which science is unquestioned and you're just told to believe what the scientific experts say. Now you may say, but we're living through a pandemic, and so of course it's now more important than ever that you just listen to what the scientists say. If we don't have trust in science, then what is there for us to do during a pandemic? And I think again, I think the response at least is that it is not enough simply to assert that you must trust the scientists, because we're living in a time period in which scientific authority is being called into question. So it can't simply be trust the scientist, because lots of people don't trust scientists, and there are a lot of maybe not good reasons, maybe not all bad reasons, but there are reasons people don't trust scientists. And so simply asserting the authority of science as if it is self-evident is not going to be an effective way to convince them. And so there is this sense among a certain intellectual class that science is simply this unquestioned thing. And I think the evidence for that speaks for itself. When you think about how people just assert science um, as this unquestioned thing in the midst of a pandemic. And so that might be one way to think about it. I'm not saying we shouldn't trust scientists, um, but I do think it needs to be more complicated than that, is that we need to be concerned about the extent to which why people are distrustful of scientists. And I think Feyerabend's concern is that is that there is a kind of smugness and intellectual superiority that scientists have over people, and they haven't ever stopped to justify why science is better. They haven't actually stopped to show them why. And so that might be kind of evidence of something that's going on now. Um, but um, I want to just kind of continue with that point that Feyerabend, the evidence that Feyerabend thinks that science is simply, you know, unquestioned. He says, for example, on page 74, that he says, for example, on page 74, that no one says one believes that the Earth moves around the sun. Nobody says that. You just say the Earth moves around the sun. That's it. You just say it. It's a fact. You don't attach that qualifier to it. One believes that the Earth moves around the sun. Whereas in lots of things in politics, morality, religion, we say one believes. Whereas in science, so we're sort of saying that this thing is true independent of us. It has nothing to do with us, and that's kind of along the lines of the value-free ideal. One doesn't believe it; it just is the case. Um, One can come to know it as a result of studying astronomy, but but that doesn't mean that it somehow isn't true until you study astronomy. It's true. It's just you come to know of its truth once you study it. And so again, that's just kind of Feyerabend is saying this goes to the unquestioned sort of nature of science. And so um, what we get on page 75 here, science, he is saying that upon its arrival during the Enlightenment, science did have a liberating effect. It shows up as a way of kind of releasing people from the dogmatic kind of shackles of something like religion. Religion, which was so intertwined with every aspect of human life that you have this new way of engaging with the world that shows us that we do not have to rely upon biblical texts or biblical authorities or religious authorities to tell us about what the world is like. Now we have a new way of engaging with the world. Science, it has liberated us. And so upon its arrival, the modern scientific revolution was liberating for so many people. But what Feyerabend says, simply because it was liberating then, does not follow that it is still liberating today. That science has become an ideology, just like other ways of engaging with the world. And what is it that's problematic about thinking of science as an ideology? Well, let me just kind of pause for a moment and think about what is it that's problematic about thinking ideologically, period. Well, ideological thinking tends to be very rigid in nature. And ideological thinking often comes up in the context of politics. That, for example, conservatism is a political ideology. Liberalism is also a political ideology. And when you hear people, it's not as though every time ideological thinking is invoked that someone is critical of it, but often in the context of politics, um, people are critical of ideological thinking. It doesn't need to be, it's not bad as such, but it can become bad if it's all you subscribe to. And ideological thinking is marked by the idea that the way that you see the world is the only way that the world can make sense. There is no other possibility by which the world can make sense. And therefore, somebody who subscribes to, again, just to kind of be just to use a generalization, somebody who subscribes to a conservative ideology says that government intervention and interference in human beings' lives is bad. And that is kind of the underlying principle of, um, of conservatism. And so, therefore, anything that happens in the world when the government tries to get involved, it immediately gets um, filtered through that general principle. Government intervention in human beings' lives is bad, to put it crudely. And so anything that happens gets filtered through that. So anything you read, any media you consume is filtered through that general principle, and that is how it's made sense of, according to that principle. That is kind of ideological thinking. And it happens the same way potentially on the other side. The government intervention in human lives is good. So it's not just picking on one side here. Similarly, somebody who subscribes to what I referred to earlier as scientism. Scientism would be a kind of ideology that suggests that the best way to solve human problems, to solve any human problem, is through the use of science and technology. It's through the use of innovation, so to speak. And so any human problem ought to be solved with more science and more technology. And it's this kind of all consuming thinking that makes it ideological, that you are not open to the idea that there are other ways of dealing with human problems and human, um, you know, human problems. There are no other ways of dealing with it. And science is the way to deal with it. So that's scientism. Science as an ideology that the best way to solve human problems and the best way to deal with human problems, and the best way of engaging with the world is through science. So science, Feyeraband argues, has unfortunately come to have this ideological status, and that is his concern. That science is no longer liberating, but that now science has an ideological status. And again, I think the evidence for this is somebody, I think of somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think of Bill Nye. I think of there's a guy. His name is not jumping off the top of my head, but Richard Dawkins. These kinds of individuals who really they make these statements that somehow it's just obvious that science is better, that these other pursuits are a waste of time. Neil deGrasse Tyson often is very critical of something like philosophy or philosophers asking questions about science, that somehow it's not really worth the scientist's time to have to engage with philosophical questions. In fact, that goes back to one of the very first readings of the semester was why students, when they take a philosophy class, they tend not to want to take a philosopher's perspective seriously about science because, the idea that facts are facts, right? A fact is just a fact, and nothing else really matters. I recall when I taught this class, I think it was a year ago, and Neil deGrasse Tyson had put out some kind of tweet about a school shooting and how really he put out a tweet that, and you could look this up, I can't remember, but he said something like how people put out, they say that the U.S. has this huge problem with mass shootings, but how mass shootings are really only a really small percentage, and how it's not about emotions, just about facts. And he was kind of ridiculed for that pretty strongly because it is about emotions, right? We do have to. So anyways, that was just one example, and you can Google that if you want. But you know, I just wanted to say that that is really what's going on in that first part. Is that Feyerabend says one. So to kind of wrap this first part up, one, science, the superiority of science is not argued for; it's just assumed, and that science, uh, in the present day, science has come to have the status of a kind of ideological thinking, and the name of that science as an ideology is scientism. Science need not be that way, but it has come to achieve the status of a kind of ideology. The unquestioned authority of science makes it have the status of ideological thinking. And just real quick, one other. So if we had to say, so I said before that the kind of ideological line of science is that science is the best way to deal with human problems. Well, I think another way to think about that is the extent to which science relies on something like quantification and measurability, right? That that science suggests that any human problem can be solved simply through measurement and quantification, that we can kind of carve up the world and make sense of it quantitatively. And often when I teach this, I think students usually, and I think of like dating apps and algorithms, the extent to which algorithmic thinking consumes so much of our life these days on social media, on these dating apps, that algorithmic thinking, that our desires and our interests can simply be quantified. And that kind of thinking, I think, is what's scary. And that seems to also be evidence of something like scientism. That I think students, when I teach this, students often say, no, I don't want my love, my emotions to be quantified. That just doesn't make sense. That would be evidence that science has gone too far. It has encroached into areas of our lives that make me uncomfortable. And so that's just more evidence, I think, that to the there is something to the idea that some scientists and individuals regard science as um, an ideology and as the way to deal with human problems. Now, I'm going to move on to part two quickly, and I just want to have a little bit to say. I wanted you to read to page 79 today and to stop at section 3 titled The Specter of Relativism. And I just want to look at that quickly. Um, what's going on in this section is that Feyeraband wants to kind of examine how science can fit within a democratic context. Because on the one hand, um, we have democracy, and democracy has certain values that go along with it. The values that go along with democracy is that that everybody should have equal access to certain. Well, everybody should be able to vote is one way, but this general principle of equal access is a basic principle of democracy. Also, another principle of democracy is that democracy should be deliberative, which is to say, it should involve everyone at the same time. That goes along with equal access. So the idea that democracy should be deliberative is that decisions should be made by everyone together, discussing together. And the concern with something like science is how can science fit within a democracy that has those kinds of values? Because science regards the expert as important, that the expert knows better, the expert knows best. And so in this section, I think Feyerabend wants to ask the extent to which science fits in a democratic context. And I think you see the consequences of trying to have expertise and mass participation in a democracy coinciding and trying to coexist. You see that in the time of a global emergency or a pandemic in the United States. You see the tensions that arise in the context of science and a democracy coexisting together. And Feyerabend sort of wants to say that that there is an inherent tension between the two. And the question is, how do we deal with this tension between science and democracy? And in this section, what you're going to get is Feyerabend's first sort of argument for something like relativism. And there's more that's going to go into, I'm going to say more about the relativism stuff in section 3, but um, the what he's saying, and I'm just taking a look at the reading here. I have it in front of me. I'm just taking a look at this reading here to sort of. I want to make sure I want to ask you what to focus on. Feyerabend wants to kind of be critical of what he's going to call the liberal intellectual, and he talks about that at the beginning of section 2. Somebody who advocates for democracy. He thinks that the liberal intellectual finds themselves in a conundrum. And by liberal intellectual here, I want to take a step back for a moment and tell you what a liberal here does not refer to Democrat. Liberal has a much broader meaning. Liberal Enlightenment thought. Liberal is sort of just a term that goes along with the Enlightenment, so to speak. Liberal simply means the idea that um, you know liberalism goes along with something like individual rights, the fact that everyone's beliefs should be tolerated alongside each other's, that we should have tolerance and respect for all beliefs as having equal worth. Those are liberal ideas. Those aren't Democrat ideas like we would say today. They're just liberal ideas that go along with the Enlightenment. Um, so And Feyeraband kind of wants to come along here and say that it was originally thought, at least according to liberalism, that liberalism and science kind of went together. That science has a similar belief. It's a kind of open-mindedness to the world. That science, in the modern scientific revolution, some of the hallmarks of good scientific thinking are openness to the world, tolerance of other beliefs, openness to being wrong, things like that. And so the liberal intellectual and the science to seemingly go together, originally conceived according to like Enlightenment thought. But of course, um, what Feyerabend wants to point out is that the liberal intellectual here who says, yes, I tolerate anyone's beliefs, yes, I think everyone's beliefs are as good as any other, he wants to point out that they're basically a hypocrite. That somebody who is the liberal intellectual, unfortunately, cannot at one and the same time say that they respect everyone's beliefs, to believe whatever, not to believe whatever they want, but to subscribe to ways of life that make them happy, and that all of us should get to have our beliefs about what makes us happy, and no one should get to interfere with it. That is a liberal tenet. But what Feyerabend thinks is happening is that in fact the liberal is actually at the same time that they say yes, I respect everyone's belief to believe whatever they want, to subscribe to things that make them happy. At the same time, they say that, but they are also asserting the superiority of their own. And so the question is, can you claim you respect and tolerate all beliefs without asserting the superiority of your own at the same time? That's the central question, right? So again, this is a big question. Let me just kind of focus you here on, and this is going a bit long. Can you suggest that you tolerate all beliefs? You tolerate all ways of living that make people happy without, at the same time, asserting the superiority of your own? Can you do both? And Feyerabend doesn't think that those who subscribe to something like science actually can. He thinks that, in fact, this is going to go on to pages 78 and 79, right? That he says here at the top of page 79, rationalists and scientists cannot rationally argue for the unique position of their favorite ideology. So what he's saying there is it's not possible for someone who advocates science to at the same time suggest that all other belief systems are just as valid as science. So he refers to things like you know uh, rain dances and kind of voodoo and mythic religions and things like that. Is somebody who advocates science, does somebody think that those are actually on the same level as science? Or are they saying, go ahead, do what you want to do, but I don't actually respect you? Right? And what Feyerabend asks here, and this is a crucial question on 79, he says, is it not rather the case that traditions that give substance to the lives of people must be given equal rights and equal access to key positions in society, no matter what other traditions think about them? Must we not demand that ideas and procedures that give substance to the lives of people, be made members of a free society, no matter what other traditions think about them? And again, this is where he thinks that this is inviting the call for relativism. And people are very scared of relativism because it's a kind of anything goes society. There are no rules. Everything's chaos. Everybody's running around doing whatever they want. And, Feyerabend simply wants to pause here and say, um, if you are truly an advocate for liberal tolerance of other traditions other than your own, and he thinks science is tied up here with the liberal intellectual. That the liberal intellectual wants to say they respect other traditions and other ways of engaging with the world, simply like religion, for example, but that they don't truly believe that. It's simply their way of paying lip service. And to truly tolerate other ways of engaging with the world, you would need to admit that they are all equally valid and that none is better than the other. And I'm going to say more about that specific point in the next lecture.